When Clara Whitfield knocked on the cowboy's door like she didn't deserve an answer, she never expected Daniel Caine to invite her in or to discover that her desperate brother had framed him for cattle theft to claim the reward money. As accusations fly and hidden truths surface on the Nebraska plains of 1867, Clara must choose between family loyalty and the integrity of a man who showed her unexpected kindness. But what happens when the real criminal turns out to be closer to home than she ever imagined? The blood on her hands wasn't hers, but Clara Whitfield knew it might as well have been. She stood before the wooden door of the ranch house, the autumn wind of 1867 whipping across the Nebraska plains like nature's own warning. The setting sun painted everything the color of old copper, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Her brother James had sent her here with a message that could destroy a man's life. The door looked like it had weathered 1,000 storms, its paint peeling in places where the harsh prairie winds had beaten against it year after year. Clara raised her hand to knock, then stopped. What if Daniel Caine really was a cattle thief? What if James was right, and she was about to face a dangerous man alone? But they needed the money. $50 was more than her family had seen in months, and winter was coming fast. Their small farm couldn't survive another harsh season without help. The bank had already sent 2 letters about their loan, and Richardson's men had been asking questions around town. Clara knocked 3 times, each rap softer than the last. The sound seemed to disappear into the endless sky above, lost among the whispers of dying grass. Inside the house, something creaked. Then came the sound of boots on wooden floors, slow and careful. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to look braver than she felt. The door opened. The man who stood there was nothing like she'd expected. James had described a rough outlaw, someone who looked like trouble. But Daniel Caine stood in the doorway like he owned the whole prairie, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his weathered face kind but alert. His hat cast shadows across features that spoke of years under the unforgiving sun, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the slow rhythm of the plains, "I guess I better introduce myself." Clara found herself staring. Up close, Daniel looked less like a criminal and more like a man who'd simply lived a hard life honestly. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well cared for. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her father before the sickness took him, a steadiness that made her feel safer just looking at him. "You're him," she said, then immediately felt foolish for such an obvious statement. "I'm Daniel Caine, if that's what you mean." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior of his home. "Though I have to say, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right, miss?" Clara hesitated. The smart thing would be to deliver James's message and leave. But something about Daniel's gentle manner made her want to stay, to sit down and talk like normal people, instead of dancing around accusations and threats. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said finally. "I need to. That is, my brother asked me to." "Whitfield." Daniel's expression changed. Not angry exactly, but more careful. "That would make your brother James." The way he said it told Clara everything she needed to know. James had been here before, or at least his reputation had reached this place. She felt her cheeks burn with shame, though she wasn't sure why. "He's not a bad person," she said quickly. Things have been difficult lately." Daniel nodded slowly. "They have been for a lot of folks. The winter of '66 was hard on everyone, and this year's drought didn't help matters." He paused, studying her face. "But I'm guessing you didn't ride all the way out here to discuss the weather." Clara's hands twisted in her shawl. How could she explain that her brother suspected Daniel of cattle theft? How could she tell this kind man that James wanted her to spy on him, to find evidence that would put him in jail? "Maybe we should talk inside," Daniel said gently. "Coffee's still warm and it's getting cold out here." The invitation hung in the air between them. Clara knew she should refuse, should deliver her message and ride back to town before full darkness fell. But something about Daniel's steady presence made her want to trust him, made her want to believe that maybe James was wrong about everything. Yes, thank you." As Daniel led her into his home, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing more than just a threshold. The interior was simple but comfortable. with handmade furniture and a stone fireplace that radiated warmth. Everything was neat and clean, organized in a way that spoke of a man who took pride in his surroundings. "Please sit," Daniel said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "I'll get that coffee." Clara perched on the edge of the wooden chair, her back straight with nervous energy. She watched as Daniel moved around his kitchen with practiced ease, pouring coffee from a pot that sat on the stove. His movements were careful and deliberate, like a man who'd learned to do things right the first time. "How do you take it?" he asked. "Black is fine." Clara had never actually had coffee with anything in it, but she didn't want to seem difficult. Daniel handed her a chipped ceramic mug, and she wrapped her cold fingers around it gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She took a small sip and tried to think of how to begin. "Your brother came by last week," Daniel said, settling into a chair across from her. "Had some interesting things to say about me." Clara's stomach dropped. "He did?" "Said I'd been stealing cattle from the Richardson spread. Said he had proof." Daniel's voice remained calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Thing is, Miss Whitfield, I've never stolen anything in my life, and I've certainly never taken anything from Richardson." "James wouldn't lie," Clara said automatically, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt doubt creeping in. "No," Daniel agreed, "but he might be mistaken. Or desperate. Desperate people sometimes see things that aren't really there." Clara stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise from the dark surface. James had been different lately, more agitated and secretive. He'd been spending time with men she didn't recognize, and he'd had money recently, not much, but more than they'd had in months. When she'd asked about it, he'd just said he was working on something that would solve all their problems. "The reward," she said suddenly. Daniel nodded. "Richardson posted a $50 reward for information about his missing cattle. That's a lot of money for a family in your situation." Clara felt her face burn with shame. "You know about our debts?" "I know Richardson holds the mortgage on half the farms in this county," Daniel said gently. "And I know what it's like to struggle. Before I bought this place, I worked other men's land for years, trying to save enough to start over." "Then you understand why James might be." Clara trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Desperate enough to accuse an innocent man?" Daniel's voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Yes, I understand, but understanding and accepting are two different things." Clara set down her coffee mug with shaking hands. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here." "But you did come." Daniel leaned forward, his storm cloud eyes serious. "And I'm guessing there's more to this than just your brother's accusations. What did he ask you to do, Clara?" The question hit her like a physical blow. How could Daniel know? How could he see through her so easily? "He asked me to keep you busy," she whispered. "To distract you while he moved the cattle back to Richardson's property." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "So he did steal them. He said he was going to return them after he collected the reward. He said it was like borrowing, not stealing." Clara's words came out in a rush. "He said no one would get hurt, and we'd finally have enough money to pay our debts." "And what did you say?" Clara looked up at him, surprised by the question. "I said I'd do it. I said I'd come here and lie to you. But you're not lying now." "No," Clara said, and realized it was true. "I'm not." Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. "Your brother made a mistake, Clara. A big one. But it's not too late to make things right." "What do you mean?" "I mean the cattle are probably still on his property or hidden somewhere nearby. If we can find them before Richardson does, maybe we can figure out a way to return them without anyone going to jail." Clara felt a spark of hope. "You'd do that? Even after what James did?" Daniel turned back to her, and she saw something in his face that made her heart skip. "I'd do it for you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara felt her cheeks grow warm again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something else entirely. Something that made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would work out. But as she sat there in Daniel's warm kitchen, watching the last light fade from the prairie sky, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about her brother, about Daniel, and about herself. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. And somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of horses approaching. The horses arrived like thunder across the prairie, their hoofbeats drumming against the hard earth in a rhythm that made Clara's blood run cold. She jumped up from her chair, spilling coffee across Daniel's clean wooden table, and rushed to the window. "Get back," Daniel said sharply, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Now." Through the glass, Clara counted 6 riders silhouetted against the dying light. They moved with purpose, spreading out as they approached the house like wolves circling prey. At their head rode a man whose straight back and expensive horse marked him as someone with money and power. "Richardson," Daniel breathed. Clara's stomach twisted into knots. If Richardson was here, that meant James's plan had already fallen apart. But how? They'd agreed to wait until tomorrow night, after Clara had enough time to keep Daniel busy. Unless James had lied to her about that too. "Daniel Caine!" Richardson's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out here where we can see you." Daniel moved to the door, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there, please." "I have to." Daniel's voice was calm, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw. "Running will only make things worse." "But what if they don't listen? What if they've already decided you're guilty?" Daniel looked down at her, and for a moment, his stern expression softened. "Then I guess I'll have to convince them otherwise." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Clara close behind despite his earlier warning. The evening air was sharp with cold, and she could smell the sweat and dust of the horses as they pranced nervously in the yard. Richardson sat tall in his saddle, his silver hair gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. He wore a black coat that probably cost more than Clara's family made in a year, and his pale eyes held the kind of coldness that came from years of getting exactly what he wanted. "Evening, Richardson," Daniel said, his voice level. "What brings you out this way?" "You know damn well what brings me here." Richardson's horse sidestepped, and he controlled it with an expert hand. 20 of my best cattle are missing, and I have it on good authority they've found their way to your property." Clara's breath caught. 20 cattle? James had only mentioned a few, but before she could process this new information, Richardson's cold gaze shifted to her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice carried a note of false sympathy. "I'm surprised to find you here. Does your brother know where you are?" Clara's throat felt dry as dust. She came to warn me about the accusations," Daniel interrupted smoothly. "Wanted to give me a chance to explain myself before anyone did anything rash." Richardson's smile was sharp as a blade. "How noble. And what exactly did you tell her, Caine?" "The truth. That I've never stolen anything in my life, and I've certainly never taken anything from you." "Is that so?" Richardson reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He tossed the paper down, and it landed at Daniel's feet. Clara watched as he bent to pick it up, his face growing darker as he read whatever was written there. "Where did you get this?" Daniel asked. "From James Whitfield, not 2 hours ago. He came to me with information about your cattle rustling operation. Said he had proof you'd been stealing from me for months." Clara felt the world tilt around her. "No," she whispered. "He wouldn't." "Oh, but he would," Richardson said, and now his voice held genuine pleasure. "And he did. Showed me exactly where you've been hiding my cattle, too. We already retrieved them, Caine. Every last one." Daniel crumpled the paper in his fist. "This is a lie. All of it. The evidence says otherwise." Richardson gestured to 2 of his men, who dismounted and began walking toward the house. "We found 20 head of my cattle in your north pasture, all bearing my brand. We also found this interesting collection of bills of sale, all signed with your name, all dated over the past 6 months." Clara's mind reeled. Bills of sale? James had never mentioned anything about paperwork. But then, James had never mentioned a lot of things, apparently. "Those aren't mine," Daniel said firmly. "I've never seen them before." "Funny thing about that," Richardson said. "The handwriting matches samples we have from when you bought supplies in town. Amazing how careful records can be so useful." One of Richardson's men reached the porch and held out a pair of iron shackles. "Hold out your hands, Caine." "Wait," Clara said, stepping forward. "This doesn't make sense. If Daniel was stealing cattle, Why would he hide them on his own property? Why not sell them right away? Richardson's eyes narrowed. What makes you think he wasn't selling them, Miss Whitfield? We found evidence of that too. What evidence? Bank records showing regular deposits to his account. More money than a man could make honestly with a spread this small. Richardson's smile widened. Your brother was very thorough in his investigation. Clara felt sick. James had been acting strange for weeks, disappearing at odd hours and coming back with mud on his boots. She'd assumed he was looking for work. But what if he'd been doing something else entirely? How much did you pay him? Daniel asked quietly. I beg your pardon? How much did you pay James Whitfield to set me up? Richardson's expression didn't change, but Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Daniel's voice was getting stronger, more confident. You needed someone to blame for your missing cattle, and James needed money. So you made a deal. He'd provide the evidence, and you'd provide the reward. That's ridiculous. Is it? Daniel looked directly at Clara. Tell me, when did your brother first mention the missing cattle? When did he first suggest I might be involved? Clara thought back, trying to remember. About 2 weeks ago. He came home from town and said he'd heard rumors. 2 weeks ago was when I turned down Richardson's offer to buy my land, Daniel said. Interesting timing, don't you think? Richardson's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's growing agitation. That's enough. You're under arrest for cattle theft, Caine. Anything else you have to say can be said to the judge. Wait, Clara said again, this time more forcefully. If James really found evidence of cattle theft, why didn't he go to the sheriff? Why come to you directly? It was a good question, and Clara could see that Richardson knew it. The older man's jaw tightened, and he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Because the sheriff is an elected official, Richardson said finally. He has to follow certain procedures. I prefer to handle these matters more directly. You mean you prefer to handle them illegally? Daniel said. I prefer to handle them efficiently. Richardson gestured to his men again. Arrest him. But as the two men approached the porch, Clara heard something that made her blood run cold. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of more horses, moving fast across the prairie. These weren't the measured hoofbeats of Richardson's men. These were the desperate pounding rhythms of horses being pushed to their limits. Someone's coming, she said. All eyes turned toward the sound. In the gathering darkness, Clara could make out shapes moving across the grassland, but she couldn't tell how many or who they might be. The riders were still too far away to identify, but they were heading straight for the ranch. Expecting more company, Caine? Richardson asked. No, Daniel said, but Clara could hear the worry in his voice. No, I'm not. The approaching horses grew louder, closer. Clara counted at least 4 riders, maybe more. They were riding hard, like they were chasing something or running from it. As they got closer, she could make out details. One of the horses was limping, and one of the riders was slumped over his saddle. That's my brother, she whispered. James was barely staying on his horse, his face pale and his clothes torn. Blood streaked his shirt, and his left arm hung at an awkward angle. Behind him rode 3 men Clara didn't recognize, their faces grim and their hands resting on their guns. What the hell? Richardson breathed. The riders thundered into the yard, dust flying everywhere. James's horse stumbled to a stop and he half fell, half slid from the saddle. Clara ran to him, catching him as he collapsed. James, what happened? They found out, James gasped. About the cattle. About everything. Who found out? The real thieves, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones who've been stealing from Richardson all along. Clara looked up at the 3 men who had followed her brother. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men who were used to violence, and their eyes held the kind of coldness that made her shiver. Evening, folks, the leader said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. Sorry to interrupt your little party, but we have some business to discuss. Richardson's face had gone pale. Who are you? Name's Cole Bradley, the man said. And these are my associates. We've been running a little operation in this area for the past few months, and we've run into a problem. What kind of problem? Daniel asked. Bradley's smile was sharp as a wolf's. The kind where someone's been taking credit for our work. Someone's been blaming an innocent man for crimes we committed. He looked directly at Richardson. And we can't have that. Clara felt her world shift again. The real cattle thieves? But that would mean... Daniel's innocent, she breathed. As a newborn lamb, Bradley confirmed. We've been watching him for weeks, making sure he was a good candidate for taking the blame. Upstanding citizen, lives alone, has enough cattle of his own that a few extra wouldn't be noticed right away. He paused. But then, your brother here got greedy. James tried to speak, but only blood came out. Clara held him tighter, her mind racing. What do you mean, greedy? I mean, he figured out what we were doing and decided to make his own deal with Richardson. Thought he could frame Caine and collect the reward money. Bradley's expression darkened. Problem is, we already had plans for that money. Richardson's voice was carefully controlled. What do you want? What we want is for everyone to understand the situation clearly, Bradley said. We're the ones who've been stealing your cattle, Richardson. We're the ones who've been selling them to buyers up north. And we're the ones who are going to continue doing it until we decide we're finished. And if I refuse to cooperate? Bradley's hand moved to his gun. Then you're going to have a lot more problems than missing cattle. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara could feel the tension building, could see the way Daniel's hand inched toward his own weapon. Richardson's men were outnumbered, and they all knew it. What about him? Richardson gestured toward James. Your boy there made a mistake, Bradley said. He tried to cut himself in on our operation without asking permission. We don't like that. So you hurt him. We taught him a lesson. Question is, what are we going to do with the rest of you? Clara looked around the yard, taking in the faces of the men surrounding them. Daniel stood tense and ready, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. Richardson's men were skilled, but they were also scared. And Clara herself was trapped in the middle, holding her wounded brother and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. There's another way, she said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. Bradley raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what might that be, little lady? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to speak clearly. You want to keep stealing cattle without being caught. Richardson wants his cattle back. Daniel wants to clear his name. And James. She looked down at her brother. James wants to make things right. Go on, Bradley said, though his tone suggested he was humoring her. What if we all get what we want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds, could feel the weight of possibilities and consequences pressing down on them all. And somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of more horses approaching. But whether they were bringing salvation or more trouble, she couldn't tell. Not yet. Sheriff coming! One of Bradley's men shouted, his horse spinning in nervous circles. 2 miles out! Riding hard with a posse! Clara's heart stopped. The sheriff meant law and order, but it also meant questions she wasn't ready to answer. James groaned in her arms, his blood seeping through her dress, while around them men reached for their guns like it was Sunday morning, and they were reaching for their hats. How many? Bradley barked. 6, maybe 7, they got rifles? Richardson's face went white as fresh snow. If they find us all here together, they'll find a lot more than that, Bradley said, his voice cold as Winter Creek water. They'll find 20 head of stolen cattle with your brand on them, hidden in places that'll make everyone here look guilty. Clara looked around the yard, seeing the trap they'd all walked into. Daniel stood rigid beside her, his hand hovering near his gun but not drawing it. Smart man. Richardson's men were shifting in their saddles, wanting to run but knowing it was too late. And James. James was trying to say something through the blood. What is it? Clara whispered, leaning closer to her brother. The cave, James gasped. North Ridge. That's where they really are. The cattle. Bradley's head snapped toward them. Shut him up! No, Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. He's trying to help. Help? Bradley laughed, but there was no humor in it. Lady, your brother is the reason we're in this mess. He was supposed to keep his mouth shut and let Caine take the blame. Instead, he got greedy and started his own little game with Richardson. What game? Daniel asked. Richardson looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The boy came to me 3 days ago, said he knew who was really stealing my cattle, but he wanted payment for the information. You paid him? Clara couldn't hide her shock. I gave him $20 as a down payment. The rest was supposed to come after he provided proof. Richardson's voice was bitter. Instead, he tried to frame an innocent man. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. Clara could make out individual voices now, men calling to each other across the prairie. Sheriff Morrison's voice rose above the rest, commanding and sure. "We need to move," Bradley said. "Now." "Move where?" Daniel asked. "They'll track us wherever we go." "Not if we split up." Bradley's mind was working fast. Clara could see it. "Richardson, you and your men head back to town. Act like you were never here. Caine, you come with us." "Like hell," Daniel said. It wasn't a request. Bradley's gun was in his hand now, though Clara hadn't seen him draw it. "You're our insurance policy. If the sheriff wants to find his cattle thieves, he'll have to deal with us first." Clara felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. If Daniel went with Bradley, she might never see him again. If he stayed, the sheriff would find them all together, and questions would be asked that had no good answers. "Take me instead," she said. Everyone stared at her. Even James stopped coughing long enough to look shocked. "Clara, no," Daniel said. "Yes." She stood up, leaving James propped against the porch post. "I'm the one who came here to lie to you. I'm the one who helped James plan this whole thing. If anyone should pay for it, it should be me." Bradley studied her with those cold wolf eyes. "You got spirit, girl. But spirit don't make good hostages." "Maybe not," Clara said. "But I make a better one than Daniel. You kill him, and you got a dead man. You kill me, and you got a dead woman. Which one do you think the sheriff will chase harder?" The logic was brutal, but it was also true. In 1867 Nebraska, a woman's death would bring down the full weight of the law in ways that a man's might not. "Interesting point," Bradley said. "But there's a third option." "What's that?" "We kill them all and blame it on Caine. Sheriff arrives to find a cattle thief who went crazy when he got caught, shot everyone in sight, then turned the gun on himself." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heart beating, could hear the wind stirring the grass, could hear the distant sound of approaching horses, but mostly, she could hear the sound of her own fear, loud as thunder in her ears. "You'd really do that?" Richardson asked. "I'd do whatever it takes to protect my operation," Bradley said. "Question is, what would you do to protect yours?" Clara saw the moment when Richardson made his choice. It was there in his eyes, in the way his shoulders straightened, in the way he looked at her and Daniel like they were already dead. "The girl's right about one thing," Richardson said slowly. "A dead woman brings questions, but a disappeared woman, that's just another prairie tragedy." "What are you saying?" Daniel asked. "I'm saying we make this simple. Bradley takes the girl and disappears. The sheriff finds me and my men investigating reports of cattle theft. We found evidence that Caine was involved, but by the time we got here, he was already gone, probably headed for Colorado territory." "And James?" Clara asked. "James is a hero," Richardson said. "He discovered the cattle theft and tried to stop it. Got hurt in the process, but he'll recover, with proper care and proper gratitude." Clara understood. James would live, but he'd be bought and paid for. Richardson would own him, just like he owned half the county. "And what about the real thieves?" Daniel asked. "What happens when they steal more cattle?" "They won't," Richardson said, "because they'll be long gone. Won't you, Bradley?" Bradley's smile was sharp as a knife. "That depends on how generous you're feeling, Richardson. A man's got to make a living." "How much?" $5,000. "And we disappear forever." Clara's head spun. $5,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. But for a man like Richardson, it might be worth it to make his problems disappear. "And if I refuse?" "Then you get to explain to the sheriff why you're standing in a yard full of dead bodies." The hoofbeats were close now. Clara could make out individual horses, could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather saddles. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried clearly on the wind. "Spread out, boys. Check the barn first." "Decision time," Bradley said. Richardson looked around the yard, taking in the scene. His men nervous and ready to run. Daniel, calm but outnumbered. James, bleeding and barely conscious. And Clara, standing in the middle of it all like the eye of a storm. "Done," Richardson said. "But I want proof that you'll keep your word." "What kind of proof?" "The girl stays here, with me. If you disappear like you promised, I'll let her go. If you don't, she dies," Bradley finished. "I like it. Clean and simple." "No," Daniel said. "I won't let you use her like that." "You don't have a choice," Richardson said. unless you want to explain to the sheriff why you're standing over a yard full of bodies." Clara felt the trap closing around them all. In a few minutes, Sheriff Morrison would arrive with his posse. They would find a scene that could be interpreted in a dozen different ways, and whoever controlled the story would control the outcome. "There's another way," she said suddenly. "What now?" Bradley asked, but he sounded more curious than annoyed. "What if we tell the truth?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Clara could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds, could feel the weight of possibilities and consequences pressing down on them all. "The truth?" Richardson laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "The truth is that we're all guilty of something. The truth is that there are no innocent people in this yard." "Maybe not," Clara said. "But there are people who want to make things right." She looked at Daniel, saw the understanding in his eyes, looked at James, who was trying to nod despite his injuries, even looked at Richardson, who seemed to be considering possibilities he hadn't thought of before. "What are you proposing?" Daniel asked. "I'm proposing that we stop running from the truth and start using it," Clara said. "Sheriff Morrison is an honest man. What if we tell him everything? What if we make a deal?" Bradley's laugh was sharp as glass. "What kind of deal?" "The kind where everyone gets what they really want," Clara said. "You want to leave Nebraska without getting caught. Richardson wants his cattle back and his reputation intact. Daniel wants to clear his name. James wants to make up for what he did wrong." "And what do you want?" Bradley asked. Clara looked around the yard one more time, taking in the faces of the men who held her fate in their hands. "I want to stop being afraid," she said. "I want to stop running from things I can't control and start fighting for things I can." The sound of hoofbeats was very close now. Clara could make out Sheriff Morrison's voice calling out orders. "Johnson, check the house. Williams, cover the back. Everyone else, stay mounted and ready." "Time's up," Bradley said. "What's it going to be?" Clara took a deep breath. "Sheriff Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying across the prairie. "We're here, and we need to talk." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Richardson cursed and reached for his gun. Bradley's men spun their horses toward the sound of approaching lawmen. Daniel stepped in front of Clara, his own weapon finally clearing leather. And James, bleeding and barely conscious, smiled. "Good girl," he whispered. "Finally doing something right." The first rifle shot cracked across the evening air like thunder, and Clara knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The bullet screamed past Clara's ear and buried itself in the wooden post behind her, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. She hit the ground hard, Daniel's weight crushing her as he tackled her to safety behind the porch steps. "Stay down!" he shouted over the chaos of gunfire and shouting horses. Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the yard. "Throw down your weapons. You're surrounded." But Bradley and his men weren't the surrendering type. They wheeled their horses in tight circles, firing at anything that moved, using the confusion to cover their escape. One of Richardson's men screamed and fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. "The barn!" Bradley shouted to his men. "We can hold them off from there." Clara pressed herself against the cold earth, feeling Daniel's heart pounding against her back. Around them, the evening air filled with smoke and the sharp crack of rifle fire. She could hear James groaning somewhere nearby, could hear Richardson shouting orders to his men. "We need to get to cover," Daniel said in her ear. "The house. Can you make it?" Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure she could. Her legs felt like water, and her hands were shaking so hard she could barely grip the porch railing. But Daniel was already moving, pulling her up and half carrying her toward the door. They made it just as another volley of shots rang out. Daniel kicked the door open and shoved Clara inside, then spun around to help James. Richardson's men were scattered across the yard, some taking cover behind water troughs, others trying to calm their spooked horses. "This is madness," Richardson said, stumbling through the doorway with blood on his face. "We need to get out of here." "No," Clara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "We need to end this." "End it?" Richardson stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Girl, there are armed men shooting at us. The only way to end this is to run." "Running is what got us into this mess," Clara said. "Everyone running from the truth, running from responsibility, running from each other." Another shot shattered the window, sending glass flying across the floor. Daniel pushed Clara away from the opening and peered out carefully. "Bradley's in the barn," he reported. "Got 2 men with him. Sheriff's got them pinned down, but they're not going anywhere." "What about the others?" Clara asked. "Scattered. Some of Richardson's men are down, but I can't tell how bad." James was propped against the wall, his face pale but his eyes alert. "Clara," he whispered, "I need to tell you something." She knelt beside him, ignoring the bullets whistling outside. "What is it?" "The cave. North Ridge. That's where Bradley's been hiding the cattle he stole. Not just Richardson's, others too. Maybe 50 head total." "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I was scared," James said. "Scared of what would happen if everyone knew how deep I was in this mess." Clara felt a stab of understanding. Fear had been driving all of them, making them do things they never would have considered in the clear light of day. "Sheriff Morrison," she called out the broken window. "I need to talk to you." "Clara, don't," Daniel warned. "It's too dangerous." "Everything's dangerous now," she said. "But maybe we can make it less dangerous." She stood up, ignoring Daniel's protests, and moved to the window. Outside, the shooting had stopped, but the tension was thick as smoke. "Sheriff Morrison," she called again. "It's Clara Whitfield. I have information about the stolen cattle." A long pause. Then Morrison's voice, cautious but interested. "What kind of information?" "The kind that can end this without anyone else getting hurt." Another pause. Clara could see the sheriff now, crouched behind a water trough with his rifle ready. He was a big man with gray hair and steady eyes, the kind of man who thought before he acted. "What do you want to tell me, Miss Whitfield?" "I want to tell you where all the stolen cattle are hidden. And I want to tell you who really stole them." "And why should I believe you?" "Because I'm tired of lying." Clara's voice carried across the yard like a bell. "Because I'm tired of being afraid. And because I'm tired of good people getting hurt for bad reasons." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to be holding their breath. "You got 1 minute," Morrison called back. "Then I'm coming in after Bradley, and anyone in the way is going to get hurt." Clara took a deep breath. This was it. The moment when she stopped being a victim of other people's choices and started making her own. "Bradley and his men have been stealing cattle for months," she shouted. "They've been hiding them in a cave on the North Ridge. They set up Daniel Caine to take the blame." "And how do you know this?" "Because my brother found out about it. He tried to make his own deal with Richardson, but Bradley caught him." "What kind of deal?" Clara looked at Richardson, who was staring at her with a mixture of fear and admiration. "The kind where my brother would provide false evidence against Daniel in exchange for reward money." "She's lying," Bradley's voice came from the barn. "Don't listen to her." "Am I?" Clara called back. "Then why don't you tell the sheriff about the bills of sale you forged? The bank records you faked? The cattle you moved to Daniel's property in the middle of the night?" The silence from the barn was answer enough. "Miss Whitfield," Morrison said, his voice thoughtful, "if what you're saying is true, then you and your brother are guilty of conspiracy." "Yes," Clara said. "We are, and we're ready to face the consequences." She could hear Daniel's sharp intake of breath behind her. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't what anyone had expected. "But," Clara continued, "we're also ready to make it right. We can lead you to the hidden cattle. We can testify against the real thieves. And we can help you understand exactly how this whole mess started. And what do you want in return?" Clara thought about it. What did she want? Safety? Security? A chance to start over somewhere else? "I want justice," she said finally. "Real justice. Not the kind where innocent people get blamed for things they didn't do. Not the kind where rich men buy their way out of trouble. Not the kind where scared people make bad choices because they don't see any good ones. That's a tall order, Miss Whitfield. Maybe. But it's the only one worth filling." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Clara could see him thinking, weighing options, considering consequences. Finally, he spoke. "Bradley, you hear all that?" "I heard it," came the reply from the barn. "What do you got to say about it?" "I got to say that little girl is smarter than she looks." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. Was Bradley actually going to confess? "Smart enough to know when she's beat," Bradley continued. "Question is, are you smart enough to know when you're making a mistake?" "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where you believe a story that's too good to be true," Bradley said. "The kind where you trust people who got reason to lie to you." Clara felt her courage wavering. Bradley was right about one thing. She did have reason to lie. She was guilty of conspiracy, of helping to frame an innocent man. Why should the sheriff believe her now? "Sheriff Morrison," Daniel said, stepping up beside her. "I know you got no reason to trust me, but I've lived in this county for 3 years. I've done business with honest people. I've paid my taxes and kept my word. And I'm telling you that everything Clara just said is true. Bradley and his men are the real thieves. They set me up to take the blame, and they're not going to stop until someone stops them. You got proof of that?" "I got proof of something better," Daniel said. "I got proof that there are people willing to stand up and tell the truth, even when it's going to cost them." Clara looked at him, saw the strength in his eyes, the steadiness that had attracted her from the beginning. He was right. This wasn't about proof anymore. This was about courage. "Sheriff Morrison," she called out, "I'm coming out there, unarmed. I'm going to tell you everything I know, and then I'm going to face whatever consequences come from it." "Clara?" "No," Daniel said. "It's too dangerous." "Maybe," Clara said, "but it's also necessary." She moved toward the door, her heart pounding but her mind clear. Behind her, she could hear Richardson cursing, James trying to call out a warning, Daniel starting to follow. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. She opened the door and stepped out into the dying light of the Nebraska evening, her hands raised, her voice steady. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, "I'm ready to tell you the truth. All of it." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant sound of a coyote calling to its mate. And in that silence, Clara Whitfield finally found the courage she'd been looking for all her life. "Don't shoot her!" Sheriff Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Anyone fires a shot, they answer to me." Clara stood in the doorway, her white dress glowing in the fading light like a ghost against the dark wood. Every gun in the yard was pointed somewhere dangerous. Every man's finger twitching on triggers that could end lives in the blink of an eye. But Clara wasn't looking at the guns. She was looking at Sheriff Morrison's face, reading the questions there, the doubt, the slim hope that maybe someone was finally going to tell him the truth. "Miss Whitfield," Morrison said, his voice careful and steady. "Walk toward me, slow and easy. Keep your hands where I can see them." Clara took a step forward, then another. The yard felt as wide as the whole prairie, every step echoing in her ears like thunder. Behind her, she could hear Daniel breathing hard, could feel his eyes on her back. "That's far enough," Morrison said when she was halfway across the yard. "Now talk. And it better be the truth, because I've got 3 wounded men and a barn full of desperate outlaws. I'm not in the mood for stories." Clara looked around the yard one more time. Richardson crouched behind a water trough, his expensive coat torn and bloody. His men were scattered behind whatever cover they could find, some groaning with pain, others watching her with desperate eyes. From the barn came the sound of Bradley's voice, low and urgent, talking to his men, planning something. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. Violence was coming, and it was coming fast. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. 3 hours ago, I came to Daniel Caine's ranch to lie to him. My brother James sent me here to keep Daniel busy, while James moved stolen cattle off Daniel's property." "What stolen cattle?" Morrison asked. "Cattle that were never on Daniel's property to begin with," Clara said. "Cattle that Bradley and his men stole from Richardson and others. Cattle they've been hiding in a cave on the North Ridge for months." "She's lying," Bradley's voice boomed from the barn. "Don't listen to her." "Am I lying about the cave?" Clara called back. "Am I lying about the 50 head of cattle you've got hidden there? Cattle with brands from 6 different ranches?" The silence from the barn was telling. Morrison's eyes narrowed. 50 head? That's a lot more than Richardson reported missing. "Because Richardson didn't know about the others," Clara said. "Bradley's been stealing from small ranchers, people who can't afford to post rewards, people who can't fight back. And how do you know all this?" Clara felt her heart hammering, but she kept her voice steady. "Because my brother figured it out. James found the cave 2 weeks ago. He saw the cattle, saw the brands, put the pieces together. And then he got scared and made the worst decision of his life. Instead of coming to you, he decided to try to make money from it." She could see the understanding dawning in Morrison's eyes. The sheriff was a smart man. and he could see how all the pieces fit together. He made a deal with Richardson, Morrison said. Frame an innocent man. Collect the reward money. Yes, Clara said, but it got complicated. Bradley found out what James was doing. That's why James is hurt. Bradley was sending us all a message. What kind of message? The kind that says if you cross him, you pay the price. Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Clara could see him weighing her words, comparing them to what he'd seen when he arrived. The pieces were adding up, but he was still missing something. Miss Whitfield, he said finally, if all this is true, then you and your brother are guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud. That's a serious crime. I know, Clara said, and we're ready to face the consequences. What about Richardson? What's his part in this? Clara looked at the older man, saw the fear and desperation in his eyes. Richardson had made his own bad choices, but he wasn't evil. Not like Bradley. Richardson got fooled, same as everyone else, she said. He wanted his cattle back, and he was willing to pay for information. He didn't know the information was false. Like hell. Richardson's voice cracked with emotion. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew James was lying, but I paid him anyway. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Clara stared at Richardson, shocked by his honesty. Why? Morrison asked. Because I wanted Daniel Caine's land, Richardson said. I've been trying to buy it for 2 years, but he won't sell. I thought if he went to jail for cattle theft, I could buy it cheap from the bank. The confession changed everything. Clara had been trying to protect Richardson, but Richardson wasn't interested in being protected. He was interested in telling the truth, even if it destroyed him. So you were all in on it, Morrison said slowly. The whole thing was a setup. No, Clara said quickly. Daniel had nothing to do with it. He's completely innocent. And you expect me to believe that? I expect you to look at the evidence, Clara said. Real evidence. Not the fake bills of sale Bradley forged. Not the false bank records. Real evidence. What real evidence? The cattle in the cave. The brands will tell you everything you need to know. The dates will show you when they were stolen. And the location will prove that Daniel couldn't have put them there. Morrison was nodding slowly. Because the cave is on the North Ridge, 20 miles from here. Exactly. And Daniel's been here all evening. You can ask anyone in town. They'll tell you he was at the general store this morning, the bank this afternoon. He couldn't have moved 50 head of cattle 20 miles and been back here by evening. Unless he had help, Bradley called out from the barn. From who? Clara shot back. Daniel lives alone. He has no hired hands, no partners. How could he move 50 head of cattle by himself? Same way we did, Bradley said. A little at a time over several weeks. Then where are the tracks? Clara asked. Where's the evidence of cattle being moved through Daniel's property? Where are the neighbors who saw cattle being driven past their land? The questions hung in the air like challenges. Clara could see Morrison thinking, working through the logic, seeing the holes in Bradley's story. You know what I think, Clara said, her voice getting stronger. I think you're scared. I think you know your story is falling apart, and you're trying to drag innocent people down with you. You little... Bradley's voice was cut off by the sound of an explosion. The barn door flew open, and smoke poured out like a gray river. Bradley and his men came charging out, guns blazing, using the confusion to make their escape. Take cover, Morrison shouted. But Clara was already moving, running toward the house, toward Daniel, toward safety. Behind her, the yard erupted in gunfire and shouting. Men dove for cover. Horses reared and screamed, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She made it to the porch just as Daniel burst through the door, his gun in his hand, his face grim with determination. Stay behind me, he said, pushing her toward the wall. What's happening? Bradley's making his move, Daniel said. He's trying to shoot his way out. Through the smoke and chaos, Clara could see the 3 outlaws on horseback, riding hard toward the North Ridge. Morrison and his men were firing at them, but the smoke made it hard to see, hard to aim. They're getting away, Clara said. Maybe, Daniel said, but they won't get far. Not with Morrison's posse tracking them. What about the cattle? What about the cave? Daniel looked at her, saw the worry in her eyes. We'll find them, he said. We'll prove everything you said is true. And then we'll face whatever comes next. Together. The word hung between them like a promise. Clara looked at Daniel, saw the steadiness in his eyes, the strength that had attracted her from the beginning. He was right. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes. Another explosion rocked the barn, and flames began licking at the wooden walls. The fire was spreading fast, driven by the prairie wind, threatening to consume everything in its path. "We need to move," Daniel said. "The fire's going to reach the house." Clara looked around the yard, seeing the chaos, the wounded men, the spreading flames. In the distance, she could hear the sound of Bradley's horses, growing fainter as they rode toward the ridge. "What about James?" she asked. "We'll get him," Daniel said. "But we need to move now." As they ran toward the safety of the open prairie, Clara couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning. Bradley was still out there, still dangerous. The cattle were still hidden in the cave, and she and James were still facing charges for their part in the conspiracy. But for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't afraid of what came next. She had told the truth, and the truth had set her free. Now all she had to do was prove it. The cave mouth yawned before them like a giant's throat, dark and forbidding against the morning light. Clara sat her horse beside Sheriff Morrison, watching as his men spread out to surround the entrance. The ride to the North Ridge had taken 3 hours, and every minute had felt like an eternity. "You sure about this, Miss Whitfield?" Morrison asked, his voice echoing slightly in the cool air. "I'm sure," Clara said, though her stomach was twisted in knots. James described it perfectly. The cave is maybe 50 feet deep, with a natural corral in the back where the cattle are kept. "And you believe Bradley and his men are in there?" "Where else would they go?" Daniel said, riding up beside them. "They know every inch of this ridge. They've been using it as their base for months." Morrison nodded grimly. "Then we do this careful and quiet. I don't want any more shooting if we can avoid it." They'd left James back at the ranch, tended by the town doctor who'd arrived just after dawn. The young man was hurt bad, but he'd live. He'd also confessed everything to Morrison, filling in the details that Clara had missed. The story was ugly but simple. Bradley and his men had been stealing cattle all summer, taking a few head at a time from small ranchers who couldn't afford to fight back. They'd been selling the cattle to buyers up north, making good money with little risk. But when Richardson posted his reward, Bradley saw an opportunity. Frame an innocent man, collect the reward money, and keep the operation running. It was a perfect plan, except for one thing. James Whitfield had found their cave. "Miss Whitfield," Morrison said quietly, "I need to know something. When your brother first told you about the stolen cattle, did you believe him?" Clara thought about it. "I wanted to believe him. We needed the money so badly, and James seemed so sure. But something felt wrong from the beginning." "What kind of wrong?" "The kind where you know someone's lying, but you want the lie to be true so much that you pretend to believe it." Morrison nodded. "That's honest. I appreciate that. Are you going to arrest me when this is over?" "That depends on what we find in that cave," Morrison said. "If your story checks out, if the cattle are there like you said, then I'll talk to the judge about reducing charges. You cooperated, you told the truth, and you helped us catch the real thieves. And if the cattle aren't there?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Then we'll have a different conversation." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. What if she was wrong? What if James had lied to her about the cave, just like he'd lied about everything else? What if this was all just another layer of deception? "Movement in the cave," one of Morrison's men called out softly. Everyone tensed. Clara could see shapes moving in the darkness, but she couldn't tell if they were men or cattle. "Hello, the cave," Morrison called out. "This is Sheriff Morrison. Come out with your hands up." Silence. "Bradley, I know you're in there. There's no other way out." Still silence. "What do you think?" Daniel asked quietly. "I think they're planning something," Morrison said. "Bradley's not the type to give up easy." As if summoned by his words, a voice echoed from the cave. "Morrison, you out there?" "I'm here, Bradley. I got a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "I got 50 head of cattle in here. Prime beef. Worth maybe $2,000. Morrison glanced at Clara, who nodded. 50 head. Just like James had said. "What about them?" Morrison called back. "I'll make you a deal. You let me and my boys ride out of here, and the cattle are yours. No questions asked." "And if I refuse?" Then you get to explain to their owners why you let their cattle die in a cave-in. Clara's blood ran cold. Cave-in? They're going to collapse the entrance, Daniel said grimly. Bury the evidence. And kill the cattle in the process, Morrison added. 50 head of prime beef, dead because of one man's greed. That's not going to happen, Clara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Miss Whitfield. No, Clara said, dismounting from her horse. I'm not going to let innocent animals die because of something I helped start. Clara, don't, Daniel said. But she was already walking toward the cave. Bradley, she called out. This is Clara Whitfield. Little lady, you shouldn't be here. Maybe not, but I am. And I want to make you a different deal. What kind of deal? Clara took a deep breath. You let the cattle go, and I'll come in there with you. Clara, no! Daniel's voice was sharp with panic. Why would I want you? Bradley called back. Because I'm the one who brought the sheriff here. I'm the one who told him about the cave. You want revenge. You take it on me. The silence from the cave was absolute. Clara could hear her own heart beating, could hear the wind whistling through the rocks, could hear Daniel cursing behind her. Interesting proposition, Bradley said finally. But what's to stop the sheriff from coming in after you? My word, Morrison called out. You let the cattle go, and I'll give you a 10-minute head start before I come in after you. 10 minutes isn't much. It's more than you deserve, Morrison said. And it's more than you're going to get if you hurt those cattle. Another long silence. Clara could see movement in the cave mouth, shadows shifting in the darkness. All right, Bradley said finally. But the girl comes in alone. No weapons, no tricks. Clara, you don't have to do this, Daniel said, grabbing her arm. Yes, I do, Clara said, looking into his eyes. This is my fault. I have to make it right. It's not your fault. You were trying to help your family. By lying to you. By helping James frame you for a crime you didn't commit. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I have to make it right. Daniel studied her face, saw the determination there, the courage that had been growing stronger all night. Then I'm going with you, he said. No. Yes. You said we'd face whatever comes next together. Well, this is what comes next. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. Daniel was willing to risk his life for her, even after everything that had happened, even after all the lies and deception. Bradley, she called out. I'm coming in, but I'm bringing Daniel with me. 2 hostages are better than 1, Bradley called back. Come ahead, but remember, no weapons, no tricks. Clara and Daniel walked toward the cave entrance, their hands raised, their hearts pounding. Behind them, Morrison and his men watched with grim expressions. The cave was cool and dark, lit only by the pale light from the entrance. Clara could hear the sound of cattle moving restlessly in the darkness, could smell the earthy scent of animals and hay. That's far enough, Bradley said, stepping into the light. Clara gasped. The man looked nothing like the confident outlaw who'd terrorized them the night before. His face was pale and drawn, his clothes torn and dirty. There was desperation in his eyes, the kind that came from knowing you were trapped. Where are your men? Daniel asked. Gone, Bradley said. Rode out this morning when they figured out we weren't going to make it. So it's just you. Just me and 50 head of cattle that are going to die if Morrison doesn't keep his word. Clara looked around the cave, seeing the cattle for the first time. They were beautiful animals, well-fed and healthy, worth far more than the $2,000 Bradley had mentioned. You can't kill them, she said. Watch me, Bradley said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Clara said, stepping forward. You can't kill them because you're not a killer. You're a thief, but you're not a killer. Don't bet on it, little lady. I am betting on it, Clara said. I'm betting that underneath all the anger and desperation, you're still a human being. I'm betting that you won't kill 50 innocent animals just to spite the sheriff. Bradley's gun wavered in his hand. You don't know anything about me. I know you're scared, Clara said. I know you're trapped, and I know you're looking for a way out that doesn't involve more bloodshed. What kind of way out? The kind where you walk away from this alive, Clara said. The kind where you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror and see a man who killed innocent animals out of spite. Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Clara could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between desperation and conscience. All right, he said finally, the cattle go free. But I want that 10-minute head start, Morrison promised. You'll get it, Clara said. But first, we need to get these cattle out of here. As they worked to move the cattle toward the cave entrance, Clara couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just one night. She'd gone from being part of a conspiracy to being part of the solution. She'd found her courage, her voice, and maybe even her future. The cattle streamed past them toward the light, toward freedom, toward their rightful owners, and Clara knew that whatever happened next, she had finally done something right. But as they watched the last of the cattle disappear into the morning sunlight, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Because Sheriff Morrison was still waiting outside, and he still had questions that needed answers. The judge wants to see you in his chambers, Miss Whitfield. Now. Clara's hand shook as she smoothed her best dress, the same one she'd worn to church before her father died. 3 weeks had passed since the cave. 3 weeks of waiting in town, while lawyers and lawmen sorted through the mess she'd helped create. Now Judge Hamilton wanted to see her, and everyone knew that meant decision time. I'll come with you, Daniel said, rising from his chair in the hotel lobby. No, Clara said, though her voice trembled. This is something I have to face alone. The courthouse was an imposing brick building that seemed to loom over the dusty main street of Fairview. Clara had walked past it 100 times in her life, but she'd never imagined she'd be walking through its doors as someone accused of conspiracy. Judge Hamilton's chambers smelled of pipe, tobacco, and old leather. The walls were lined with law books that looked like they'd been there since Nebraska became a territory. Behind a massive oak desk sat a man whose white beard and stern eyes made Clara think of an Old Testament prophet. Sit down, Miss Whitfield, Judge Hamilton said, his voice neither kind nor cruel. We have much to discuss. Clara perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. Through the window, she could see the main street of Fairview, where people were going about their daily business. Normal people with normal problems. Not people who'd helped frame innocent men for crimes they didn't commit. I've read Sheriff Morrison's report, the judge said, opening a thick folder. I've also read the statements from your brother, from Mr. Richardson, and from Mr. Caine. Quite a story, Miss Whitfield. Yes, sir. The question before me is simple. What should be done with you? Clara's throat felt dry as dust. I'm ready to accept whatever punishment you think is fair, Your Honor. Are you? Judge Hamilton leaned back in his chair, studying her. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done? Conspiracy to commit fraud is a felony. The minimum sentence is 2 years in prison. 2 years. Clara felt the words hit her like a physical blow. 2 years in a cell. 2 years away from the prairie. 2 years away from Daniel. However, the judge continued, there are mitigating circumstances. You cooperated fully with the authorities. You helped recover the stolen cattle, and you put yourself in danger to ensure that justice was served. Clara looked up, hope flickering in her chest. What does that mean? It means I have options, Judge Hamilton said. Prison is one option, but there are others. What kind of others? Community service, restitution to the victims, probation with conditions. The judge paused, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. The question is, which option serves justice best? Clara thought about everything that had happened, everything she'd learned about herself and about the world. I want to make it right, Your Honor, whatever it takes. Making it right isn't just about punishment, Miss Whitfield. It's about understanding why you made the choices you did, and making sure you never make them again. I understand. Do you? Tell me. What would you do if you found yourself in the same situation again? If your family was desperate? If someone offered you easy money for doing something you knew was wrong? Clara thought about it. Really thought about it. 3 weeks ago, she might have given the judge the answer she thought he wanted to hear. But now, she knew better. I'd find another way, she said. I'd work harder, ask for help, do whatever it took to solve the problem honestly. Because I learned that there's no such thing as easy money. There's always a price, and usually it's higher than you think. Judge Hamilton nodded slowly. That's a wise answer. Now, let me ask you something else. What do you think should happen to your brother? The question caught Clara off guard. James. He's the one who started this whole mess. He's the one who found the cave, who made the deal with Richardson, who sent you to lie to Mr. Caine. What should be done with him? Clara felt torn. James was her brother, her family, the only relative she had left. But he was also the one who'd gotten them into this terrible situation. He should face the consequences too, she said finally. But he's already been punished. He was hurt badly, and he's been sick with guilt ever since. Maybe we could work together to make things right. Together? The cattle that were stolen came from 6 different ranchers. Small ranchers. People who couldn't afford to lose even a few head. What if James and I worked to repay them? What if we found a way to make up for what they lost? Judge Hamilton's eyebrows rose. That would take years. The value of 50 head of cattle is substantial. Then we'll work for years, Clara said. However long it takes. And what about your own future? Your own plans? Clara looked out the window again, seeing the main street, the prairie beyond, the endless sky that had always made her feel small and insignificant. But now, it made her feel something else. Free. I want to build something, she said. Not just for myself, but for other people. I want to help families who are struggling, who are facing the same kind of desperation that made James and me make such bad choices. What kind of help? I don't know yet. Maybe a lending circle, where people can borrow money without going to the bank. Maybe a place where people can get advice, help with their problems before they get desperate enough to do something stupid. Judge Hamilton was quiet for a long moment. Clara could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear the sound of wagons passing on the street outside. Miss Whitfield, he said finally, I'm going to make you an offer. It's not a typical sentence, but then this isn't a typical case. What kind of offer? 5 years probation. No jail time. But during those 5 years, you'll work to repay the victims of the cattle theft. You'll also provide 100 hours of community service each year. And you'll report to me personally every month to discuss your progress. Clara's heart leaped. You mean I can stay here? In Fairview. You can stay wherever you choose, as long as you meet the conditions of your probation. The judge paused. There's one more condition. What's that? You'll work with the county to establish the kind of program you just described. A place where people can get help before they make the kinds of mistakes you and your brother made. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. You'd trust me to do that? After everything I've done? I'd trust you to do that because of everything you've done, Judge Hamilton said. Because you've learned that actions have consequences, and that the only way to truly make amends is to help prevent others from making the same mistakes. What about James? Your brother will face similar conditions, if he accepts them. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. He will. I'll make sure he does. Then we have an agreement. Judge Hamilton stood up, extending his hand. Don't disappoint me, Miss Whitfield. I won't, Your Honor. I promise. As Clara left the courthouse, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time since this whole mess started, she felt like she had some control over it. Daniel was waiting for her on the courthouse steps, his hat in his hands, worry written across his face. How did it go? He asked. Better than I hoped, Clara said, and then she was in his arms, feeling safe and loved and forgiven. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Clara looked out at the prairie, at the endless sky, at the future that stretched before them like an unwritten story. Now we build something, she said, together. But as they walked down the main street of Fairview, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Someone who didn't want them to succeed. Someone who had their own plans for the future. The fire started at midnight, and by the time Clara smelled the smoke, half of Daniel's barn was already in flames. She threw on her dress and ran outside, her heart pounding as she saw the orange glow against the night sky. Daniel! She screamed, but there was no answer from the house. The barn was fully engulfed now, the fire roaring like a living thing. Clara could hear the terrified lowing of cattle, could see shapes moving in the corral behind the burning building. The animals were trapped, and unless someone did something quickly, they would all die. She ran toward the corral, ignoring the heat and smoke, her mind focused on one thing: getting the gate open. The metal latch was hot enough to burn her fingers, but she managed to work it free. The cattle streamed out, bellowing their terror, running toward the safety of the open prairie. Clara, get back. She turned to see Daniel running toward her, his face blackened with soot, his clothes singed. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison and 3 of his deputies, all carrying buckets of water. Where were you? Clara asked, coughing from the smoke. In town, Daniel said. grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the burning barn. "Morrison came to get me. Someone reported seeing suspicious riders near the ranch." "Suspicious riders?" "Bradley's men," Morrison said grimly. "The ones who got away. Looks like they decided to send you a message." Clara felt her blood run cold. Bradley himself had been captured 2 days after the cave incident, tried quickly, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But 2 of his men had escaped. And apparently they blamed Daniel and Clara for their leader's capture. "How bad is the damage?" Daniel asked, watching as the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. "The barn's a total loss," Morrison said. "But the house is safe, and we got the cattle out. Could have been worse." "Could have been a lot worse," Clara said, thinking about what might have happened if the fire had spread to the house, or if the cattle had been trapped in the barn. As they watched the fire burn itself out, Clara couldn't help but think about irony. Here she was, 6 months after her first visit to Daniel's ranch, once again standing in his yard while danger threatened from all sides. But this time, she wasn't part of the problem. This time, she was part of the solution. The community center she'd helped establish was thriving. 3 families had already been helped with emergency loans, and 2 more had received advice that had prevented them from losing their farms. Judge Hamilton had praised her work, and even Richardson had grudgingly admitted that she was making a difference. But apparently, not everyone wanted her to succeed. "What do we do now?" Clara asked. "Now we rebuild," Daniel said simply. "We rebuild the barn, we rebuild our lives, and we don't let them win. And if they come back, then we'll be ready for them," Morrison said. "I'm posting a deputy here for the next few weeks, and I'm putting out word that anyone who helps catch these men will be rewarded." As the first light of dawn began to creep across the prairie, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened girl who'd knocked on Daniel's door like she didn't deserve an answer. Now she was a woman who'd found her voice, her courage, and her purpose. The fire had been meant to destroy, but like most acts of vengeance, it had backfired. Instead of driving Clara and Daniel apart, it had brought them closer together. Instead of destroying their work, it had strengthened their resolve. "Daniel?" Clara said as they watched the sun rise over the remains of the barn. "Yeah? Do you remember what you said to me that first night, when I knocked on your door?" Daniel smiled, his face still streaked with soot. "I said I guessed I better introduce myself. And then you invited me in for coffee." "Best decision I ever made," Daniel said, pulling her close. "Even though it led to all this trouble?" "Especially because it led to all this trouble," Daniel said. "Because without the trouble, we never would have found out what we're really made of." Clara looked around at the scene of destruction, at the blackened timbers and the scattered debris. But she also saw the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, saw the house standing strong and undamaged, saw the future stretching before them like an unwritten promise. "So, what do we do first?" she asked. "First, we have breakfast," Daniel said. "Then we start planning the new barn. And then we get back to work." "What kind of work?" "The kind that matters," Daniel said. "The kind that helps people. The kind that makes the world a little bit better than it was before." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. The fire had been meant to end their story, but instead, it had given them a new beginning. As they walked toward the house, Clara couldn't help but smile. She'd come to Daniel's ranch as a liar and a conspirator. She was staying as his partner, his equal, his future wife. And if Bradley's men wanted to try to stop them, they were welcome to try. Because Clara Whitfield had finally learned something important. She didn't just deserve an answer when she knocked on life's door. She deserved to be the one giving the answers. 6 months later, Clara stood in the same spot where Daniel's barn had burned. But now she was looking at something entirely different. The new barn was bigger and better than the old one, with modern ventilation and safety features that would prevent future fires. But more importantly, it served a dual purpose. Half of it was still a barn, housing Daniel's growing herd of cattle, but the other half had been converted into a meeting hall for the community center, a place where people could come for help, advice, and support. "You ready for this?" Daniel asked, adjusting his tie. Clara looked down at her wedding dress, a simple but elegant white gown that she'd sewn herself. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until I knocked on your door." The wedding was small but perfect. Judge Hamilton performed the ceremony. Sheriff Morrison served as Daniel's best man, and even Richardson was there, looking uncomfortable but sincere in his congratulations. James gave Clara away, walking slowly but steadily. His injuries had healed, but he still bore the scars of his poor choices. Like Clara, he was working to make amends, and like Clara, he was finding purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he'd made. "Do you, Clara Whitfield, take Daniel Caine to be your husband?" Judge Hamilton asked. "I do," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Daniel Caine, take Clara Whitfield to be your wife?" "I do," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Then, by the power vested in me, by the territory of Nebraska, I pronounce you husband and wife." As Daniel kissed her, Clara could hear the sound of applause from their friends and neighbors. But more than that, she could hear the sound of her own heart, beating strong and sure, no longer afraid of what the future might bring. The reception was held in the new barn, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the county. As Clara danced with her new husband, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing in the doorway. Sheriff Morrison was talking to a man she didn't recognize, a man with hard eyes and a badge on his chest. As she watched, Morrison nodded toward her and Daniel, and the stranger made a note in a small book. "Daniel," Clara said quietly, "who's that man talking to Morrison?" Daniel looked where she was pointing, and his expression grew serious. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're about to find out." As the song ended, Morrison approached them, the stranger close behind. "Daniel, Clara," Morrison said, "I'd like you to meet Marshal Johnson from the territorial capital. He's got some news about Bradley and his men." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of news?" "The kind that changes everything," Marshal Johnson said. "Bradley escaped from prison 3 days ago, and he's heading this way." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Bradley, the man who'd started this whole mess, was free, and he was coming for them. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do what we've always done," Daniel said, taking her hand. "We face it together." As the marshal explained the situation, Clara found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as a frightened girl who'd knocked on a door like she didn't deserve an answer. Now she was a woman who'd found her courage, her voice, and her purpose. Bradley might be coming for them, but Clara was no longer afraid. She'd learned something important over the past months. Sometimes the best way to find your strength is to face your fears head on. And she was about to get another chance to prove it.